I've long struggled with the death penalty. Whenever I hear a scriptural defense of the death penalty, it's Old Testament verses. My issue is that we don't condone the stoning of those who commit adultery or cutting off the hands of those who steal. Can you help me understand this issue with Scripture? Yeah, Madison, that's a good way to ask the question, a good, honest way. It even begins when you say you've long struggled with the death penalty. As you look even just at the Old Testament, we're going to go to the New Testament, but let's just think about the Old Testament for a moment. The Old Testament does indeed call for the death penalty for certain offenses. But what's most important, and this is really crucial, what's most important is that the death penalty for premeditated murder is what is drilled deeply into the logic of Scripture and right in the Noahic covenant, and the covenant that God made with humanity through Noah. As you look at Genesis 9, there God tells Noah that the death penalty for premeditated murder is right and necessary, because the one who would seek to slay the image of God in man forfeits his own life. And that's a tough logic. But I think we can understand it, and it's coming on a very important biblical authority here. This is a part of the covenantal history of the biblical faith. It's not just a part of the Old Testament law. It's a part of that covenantal reality. And of course, it is picked up in the New Testament, in particular in Romans chapter 13, where in speaking of the responsibility of government, Paul writes that the government does not bear the power of the sword in vain. The power of the sword is the death penalty. That's just what's being referred to there, and I think we can understand that. Now, I think we also have to understand, Madison, that this means that the death penalty, as we think of it biblically, should be applied for only the rarest and most egregious of crimes. And premeditated murder is at the very top of that list. There's something very interesting going on in America right now. I'm here speaking in November of 2018, just a few days after that horrible tragedy in Pittsburgh. And here's something I want you to note. A lot of Americans who say, I don't believe in the death penalty, I never believe in the death penalty, I believe the death penalty ought to be abolished, are the very same people who in the immediate aftermath of that horrifying, murderous, premeditated attack upon that synagogue said, only the death penalty will do. This also happened with the Boston Marathon bombing a few years ago. It was very interesting. It's interesting that there was an overwhelming impulse on the part of Americans, many of whom say they don't believe in the death penalty, that trial should actually be first and most importantly held in the federal courts where there is a death penalty for that kind of crime, rather than in the Massachusetts state courts where there is no death penalty. And you'll also note that even though there are many, let's just talk partisan politics here for a moment, there are many prominent Democrats who say they oppose the death penalty. They didn't oppose it in that case. Well, if you don't oppose it in that case, then you don't oppose the death penalty in principle. I think I'm not here even trying to make this a partisan issue. This is just a confusion that comes to us when we say the death penalty has often been misapplied. The death penalty should not be broadly applied. The death penalty should be applied with equity, and cause and effect should be a part of the context here, which is the point God makes in Genesis chapter 9. And when you look at the United States, we have a really bad record of equity when it comes to the death penalty. Over the last century, it's very, very difficult for any wealthy white person to ever actually be executed by the state. It's not impossible, but it's extremely rare because given our court system, you can afford the kind of forensic evidence and the kind of legal support that will just make it almost impossible to get a death penalty conviction or the death penalty carried out. If you're poor and minority, and in particular African American, you're much more in danger of being executed. So, Madison, it's a good question. And Christians should never celebrate the death penalty. There's sometimes in our political order a certain kind of facile, superficial, almost celebration of the death penalty. The Bible doesn't say that punishment is never about retribution. It just makes very clear that's not the ultimate issue. And we are to take no pleasure in any kind of retribution. That doesn't mean that we don't, as a society and as individuals, take some moral satisfaction in justice rightly applied. That's actually what we should demand and expect. It's a heavy question. It's a good question for Christians to discuss. And one of the first things we have to do is kind of peel the onion and make sure we're actually talking about the death penalty and not the death penalty wrongly applied. There was an article just this week published by a major conservative in the United States suggesting that the reason the death penalty should be eradicated is because we as human beings are fallible. We can make mistakes. And you know, that's absolutely true, that we as human beings are very fallible. That's why the evidentiary standard in the Old Testament for the death penalty was so high, right down to witnesses that were required, multiple witnesses, in order for the death penalty to be carried out. And so we should expect our justice system to have every safeguard possible, but not as a way of avoiding justice, but of making sure we get justice right.